My parents pressured me to babysit my nephew for free, so I moved out immediately, and what I did next shocked everyone around me. I'm a 27-year-old guy, and I thought my family respected my independence. Until they didn't. I've always been the responsible one, paying my own bills, keeping my apartment spotless, and carving out a life where I could breathe without constant interference. My small apartment in the city felt like my sanctuary, the one place where I could escape from the subtle chaos of family obligations. It wasn't a fancy space, but it was mine. Built piece by piece from long hours at work and careful budgeting. Then came the baby. My younger sister Anna had her first child, and suddenly, everything I'd carefully constructed felt like it belonged to someone else. My parents were excited, naturally, but their enthusiasm quickly transformed into pressure. At first, it was harmless. "Could you just watch him for an hour or two?" my mom would ask, smiling sweetly, as if I'd be doing a small favor. I tried to say no politely at first, but her tone had that quiet edge that made refusal uncomfortable. And then my dad would chime in. "It's only a few hours. We know you're responsible. Do the right thing." That phrase always lingered in my head, like a tiny jab reminding me of my duty. I wanted to help, truly. I loved my sister and had always been proud of my relationship with her. But every time I said yes, I felt a flicker of annoyance, a tension creeping under my skin. It wasn't just babysitting it was the way they made it feel like an obligation rather than a favor, even as I agreed for the first time. Dragging myself to her apartment on a Saturday afternoon, I couldn't shake the subtle unease. The apartment smelled faintly of baby powder, and the soft gurgles and cries of my nephew echoed against the living room walls, making me both smile and tense up at the same time. I told myself it was just once, a small sacrifice for family. But looking back now, I should have known this once would not stay a one-time thing. I had no idea that this tiny favor would slowly turn into a constant expectation, eroding my freedom piece by piece. And when my phone buzzed again that evening with another request, I felt that first twinge of dread, something I didn't yet know would grow into full-blown resentment. The next weekend came, and my phone buzzed again, this time with a more urgent tone. "Could you watch him for the whole afternoon? We have an appointment." My chest sank, but I couldn't find a polite way to say no without sounding selfish. I told myself it was just a favor, just one more time, and I packed my bag with a sense of resignation. The street smelled of rain that morning, a damp chill sneaking under my jacket, matching the unease crawling up my spine. When I arrived, the apartment was warm and chaotic, the baby fussing in his crib while Anna scrambled with laundry and bottles. "Thanks so much." My sister chirped, but her smile didn't mask the obvious relief on her face that I was there. My parents hovered nearby, offering what they called helpful advice, but really it was a subtle critique of how I handled things. "Remember, you have to keep him entertained," my mom said, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't want him crying too much." I nodded, biting back a sigh, feeling more like a temporary employee than a brother or uncle. By mid-afternoon, I realized I hadn't had a single quiet moment. Every squeal, every tumble of toys, every frantic call from Anna to the kitchen made my frustration build. I loved my nephew, but I also loved breathing, and right now I was suffocating under the weight of expectations I hadn't signed up for. My dad's phone chimed occasionally with updates, and he kept popping in with suggestions that felt more like judgments. "Maybe try singing to him." "That always works," he offered, as if I didn't know a lullaby from a nursery rhyme. As the sun dipped low, casting orange light across the cluttered living room, I felt a simmering mix of guilt and irritation. I wanted to leave, to reclaim my apartment, my freedom, my life. But my parents' eyes followed me with that quiet, assessing stare that made me freeze. I agreed to stay a little longer, convincing myself I was being helpful. But deep down, I realized this wasn't going to end with just today. Something told me this was only the beginning of a much longer pattern. The following week, my phone buzzed again before I even had a chance to sit down after work. "Hey, can you watch him tomorrow morning?" "Just a few hours," my mom's text read. I felt that familiar weight settle in my chest. A few hours. I knew by now that those few hours often stretched into an entire day, leaving me drained and resentful. Still, I typed back a hesitant yes, promising myself it was the last time the next morning. I trudged over my backpack, heavier than usual, carrying not just toys and snacks, but a growing sense of frustration. The apartment smelled of warm milk and baby lotion, a strangely comforting yet suffocating mix. Anna was frazzled, rushing around like she had a million things to do, leaving me to manage my nephew while fielding a constant stream of instructions from my parents. "Don't let him crawl near the stairs," my dad said, peering over my shoulder. "And make sure he doesn't get too cranky. You know how sensitive he is." I nodded, forcing a smile, though inside, I felt invisible, like I was just a tool for their convenience. By mid, I realized I hadn't had a single uninterrupted thought. Every squeal, every toss of a toy, every pleading glance from my nephew chipped away at my patience. One loved my sister and her child, but this was becoming unbearable. I wanted to tell them no, to reclaim my weekends and my personal space, but the guilt clawed at me. My parents' subtle judgments were always there, a quiet pressure that made refusal feel impossible. As I cleaned up spilled cereal and tried to calm a fussy baby, I felt the simmering anger I'd been suppressing for weeks finally rise. My independence was slipping through my fingers, one favor at a time. I kept thinking about my apartment, my quiet nights, and my freedom things I'd worked so hard to protect. When my phone buzzed again that afternoon, this time with a message from my mom about next weekend, I froze. My heart sank. I realized I was no longer helping. I was being used, and somehow. They didn't even see it. It happened faster than I expected. By the following week, babysitting had become a fixture in my life, an unspoken obligation I couldn't escape. My parents' calls were now almost daily, each one tinged with that subtle guilt that had become their weapon. "Can you help out tomorrow?" "Just the morning, nothing major," my mom would say, but I knew better. By the time I arrived, just the morning often stretched into 6 hours of nonstop crying, feeding, and chasing a tiny whirlwind of energy. The apartment had started to feel suffocating. The air smelled faintly of baby wipes and formula, and the carpet was scattered with toys like a minefield. Anna flitted around, juggling chores, her voice always in a rush. "Thanks for doing this," she'd say cheerfully. But I could feel the relief radiating off her in waves, as if my presence was expected, demanded, even owed. My parents hovered nearby, offering tips in that quiet, judging way that made me feel incompetent no matter what I did. By mid-afternoon, I felt a gnawing frustration building. I was tired, my back ached, and my patience was thinning faster than I could manage. My nephew crawled into every corner of the apartment, squealing and grabbing at everything. "Be careful." My dad barked from the kitchen, and I realized I wasn't helping, they were micromanaging me. Critiquing every little move, I tried to remind myself I was doing this for family, that it was temporary, but the resentment was eating at me. Every time I imagined returning to my apartment, my sanctuary, I felt a pang of longing and guilt all at once. I had started to dread my own weekends, counting down to the next forced visit, even as I was still there. And then my mom casually mentioned, as if it were nothing, "Maybe you can watch him next weekend too. We really don't want to impose, but it would be such a help." That was the moment I realized. This wasn't about helping anymore. It was about control. And for the first time, I felt a real surge of anger, mixed with the desperate urge to reclaim my life that Saturday. I hit my breaking point. My alarm buzzed before sunrise, and I realized I hadn't felt this drained in years. I was sitting at my kitchen table, coffee in hand, staring at my phone, and the message from my mom. "Can you come over today? Just a few hours. We really need you." My chest tightened, a mix of exhaustion, frustration, and simmering resentment. I loved my family, but this constant intrusion was wearing me down, eroding every ounce of independence I'd fought so hard for. When I arrived, the apartment felt more chaotic than ever. The baby was fussing before I even stepped inside, and Anna was running around with a laundry basket clutched to her chest. "Thanks for coming," she chirped, but her smile didn't hide the relief that I was there doing something she clearly expected me to do. My parents hovered nearby, offering suggestions that felt more like criticism. "Try keeping him on the playmat," my dad said, "or he'll crawl into trouble again." I nodded, forcing a smile, though inside I felt invisible, like my own needs didn't matter. By mid-morning, I felt the frustration I'd been bottling for weeks bubble over. The baby was crying, toys were scattered across the floor, and I realized I hadn't had a single uninterrupted thought. Every squeal, every spill, Every little task felt like a weight pressing down on me, a reminder that my freedom had been chipped away one favor at a time. I tried to remind myself I was helping family, but it felt hollow, and guilt and anger wove together into a bitter knot in my stomach. When my phone buzzed again, this time with a text about next weekend, I froze. My chest tightened as anger and disbelief surged through me. I realized something fundamental. I was being used, not appreciated. My parents didn't see me as an independent adult. I was just a resource-free babysitter, always available at their convenience. In that moment, sitting on the floor amidst scattered toys, I made a silent vow. Enough was enough. I couldn't live like this anymore. Something had to change, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. But I had no idea how shocked they would be when I finally acted. I thought I had reached my limit that Saturday. But the real shock came later that evening. I was scrolling through my phone, still tense from the day, when I overheard a conversation between my parents and Anna on speaker, something I wasn't supposed to hear. They were casually talking about how he's so reliable. We can always count on him to watch the baby. Maybe he could help out every weekend from now on. My chest tightened so violently it felt like my ribs were going to cave in. I replayed the words over and over in my head, disbelief mixing with anger. They weren't asking anymore, they were assuming. They had taken my good nature, my willingness to help just once, and built a schedule around it, without ever consulting me. I sat there, frozen, staring at the phone as my stomach sank. I realized that all the subtle guilt trips, the polite requests, the just a few hours lines, they were all manipulation. I had been trapped in a pattern I hadn't even agreed to. My independence, the life I'd fought so hard to maintain, had been quietly dismantled. A strange mix of emotions swirled inside my betrayal, frustration, and a sudden clarity. I didn't have to do this anymore. I could walk away. In that moment, I made a decision that had been simmering in the back of my mind for weeks. I was going to move out immediately. I didn't know exactly how my family would react, but I knew this was the only way to reclaim control over my life. I packed a small bag that night, every motion charged with quiet defiance. The apartment felt heavier with each item I packed, like I was stripping away the invisible chains my family had wrapped around me. As I zipped up the last suitcase, I could almost hear their voices in my head, planning the next weekend without me, that I was about to do something that would shock them all. The next morning, I made my move. I left my apartment early, backpack slung over my shoulder, heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. The street smelled faintly of wet asphalt from last night's rain, and the crisp morning air seemed to whisper that this was the first truly free moment I'd had in weeks. I kept my steps steady, telling myself that I wasn't running away, was reclaiming my life. When I arrived at my sister's place, my parents were already there, casually folding laundry and chatting as if everything was normal. My heart sank for a split second, but I reminded myself that I owed them nothing. I announced calmly, "I've decided I can't babysit anymore. I'm moving out." Their expressions froze. Mom's mouth opened slightly, and Dad's eyes narrowed, a mix of confusion and disbelief crossing his face. "Move out, but you can't just leave." My mom sputtered, her voice trembling slightly, trying to mask the guilt I knew she felt. I ignored the panic in their eyes and focused on my words. "I've been helping when I could, but this isn't a favor anymore, it's become an expectation. I need my independence back." Anna looked stunned, her usual smile faltering. "But the baby needs you," she said softly, almost pleading. I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't about abandoning my nephew, it was about protecting myself. I grabbed my bag and walked out. Each step lighter than the last. The apartment behind me, once suffocating, now felt like a prison I had finally escaped. I didn't look back as I got into a cab, my chest expanding with a mixture of fear, liberation, and determination. For the first time in months, I felt the thrill of autonomy, the rush of making a decision that was entirely mine. And yet, even as the city passed by in a blur, I couldn't shake the thought of how my family would react when they realized I wasn't coming back. Their surprise, maybe even Shakit, was coming. And I knew this was only the beginning of reclaiming control over my life. The first week in my new apartment felt surreal. I unpacked my few belongings, arranged the furniture exactly how I wanted, and finally felt the space breathe around me. For the first time in months, there were no baby toys scattered across the floor, no urgent calls from my parents, no guilt pressing down on my chest. I could hear the hum of the city outside and not feel trapped by anyone else's demands. Even the faint smell of fresh coffee seemed sweeter here, like it belonged only to me. I spent the first evening sitting on my couch, just listening. The quiet was almost painful at first, because I wasn't used to being alone without some obligation waiting for me. But slowly, the tension inside me started to dissolve. I realized how much of my energy had been drained by constant help I hadn't really agreed to. My freedom was intoxicating, and I could feel the anxiety that had settled in my chest over weeks begin to lift at the same time. I couldn't ignore the occasional pang of guilt. I thought about Anna and the baby, about my parents' faces when I left. I wondered if they understood why I had to do this, if they even realized how manipulative their guilt trips had been. But deep down, I knew I couldn't let their disappointment dictate my life anymore. I also started making plans for myself, things I had put off for years because my weekends were always consumed by babysitting duties. I signed up for a yoga class, bought a few books I'd wanted to read, and even treated myself to a small dinner at a place I'd always wanted to try. Each small decision was a reclaiming of my autonomy, a quiet rebellion against the life I had been forced into. As night fell and the city lights glimmered through my window, I smiled, feeling a mix of liberation and anticipation. I knew my parents were going to react soon, and I could almost imagine the confusion and frustration on their faces. But I also knew something else. For the first time in a long time, I was in control. By the middle of the week, the calls and texts started coming. At first, they were polite, my mom checking in, Anna sending a cute picture of the baby, but quickly the tone shifted. Subtle guilt seeped into every message. "We really miss you around here. Maybe you could help just this once." My chest tightened with each notification. I ignored them, feeling a strange mix of relief and quiet defiance. For the first time, I wasn't responding out of obligation. I was responding to myself. That weekend, the pressure escalated. My parents showed up at my new apartment without warning. Standing in the hallway, Mom's eyes widened in disbelief, and Dad looked like someone had handed him a puzzle he couldn't solve. "We just wanted to see if you could, maybe..." Mom trailed off, realizing the futility of her words. I stayed calm, even as my heart raced, and said firmly, "I'm not babysitting anymore. I'm done." Anna's face went pale, a mix of shock and guilt washing over her. "But the baby," she stammered, looking to our parents for backup. I felt a pang for her, but I reminded myself this wasn't about abandoning the child. It was about protecting myself from months of manipulation and control. For the next few hours, they tried every tactic they knew. Guilt, pleading, subtle shaming, even feigned disappointment. I listened without flinching. Every argument they made, every sentence they used to pull me back, only strengthened my resolve. I realized I wasn't just standing up for myself, I was teaching them that their manipulation wouldn't work anymore. As they finally left, slamming the door quietly behind them, I sank onto my couch, breathing in the quiet, feeling the adrenaline leave my body. I was exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time, I felt the full weight and the full freedom of my independence. And as I watched the city lights flicker through my window, a small, almost mischievous thought crossed my mind. They had no idea just how serious I was about reclaiming my life, and the next steps I was planning would shock them even more. A few days later, I decided it was time to take the next step. I wanted my family to understand, in no uncertain terms, that my independence wasn't negotiable. I called Anna first. "I can come by for a short visit," I said, careful with my tone, "but I'm not babysitting anymore, ever." There was a long pause on the line, then a quiet, almost guilty, "Okay, we'll see you then." I felt a flicker of satisfaction. My boundaries were finally being heard. When I arrived, my parents were there, acting casual, but their expressions betrayed them. Dad's jaw was tight, and Mom's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Anna ushered me in, the baby giggling on the couch. For a moment, I almost doubted myself, wondering if I'd been too harsh. But then I remembered the countless weekends, the drained nights, the silent resentment building in me, and I knew this confrontation had to happen. I stood in the living room, taking a deep breath, and calmly laid it out. I've been helping because I wanted to, but this has become an expectation. I'm not your free babysitter. My life, my apartment, my weekends, they're mine. I will not sacrifice them anymore. My voice was steady, but inside, I felt a mix of fear and liberation. Mom opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. I know you didn't mean to manipulate me, but that's what's happened. I can still be part of our family, but on my terms. Dad's face shifted from frustration to disbelief. You're serious? He asked, almost as if he couldn't comprehend it. I nodded completely, and I want you to respect that. There was a long, tense silence. Even Anna looked at me differently, a flicker of respect in her eyes mixed with guilt. The baby cooed, oblivious to the adult drama around him, but somehow his innocent presence made the moment feel raw, real, and irrevocable. As I left that day, I felt a quiet thrill. They had tried every tactic to control me, and for the first time, none of it worked. I knew this was the moment where everything shifted and that the shock of my resolve would ripple through the family in ways that I hadn't even imagined. In the days that followed, the change was subtle but unmistakable. My parents stopped calling with last-minute requests. Their messages became brief and neutral, and Anna no longer assumed I was available for every little thing. It was almost eerie, this quiet acknowledgement of my boundaries, but I reveled in it. For the first time, I felt my energy return weekends were mine. My apartment felt like a sanctuary again, and the tension that had followed me like a shadow finally lifted. I started doing things I had postponed for years. I cooked meals just for myself, spent long afternoons reading, and even signed up for a photography class I'd been eyeing for months. Each small act was a victory, a quiet rebellion against the control that had been imposed on me. I noticed the difference immediately. My mind felt clearer, my mood lighter, and I could breathe without that constant pressure pressing on my chest. Even my interactions with my family began to shift. When I visited, there was no underlying tension, no guilt, no expectation. Anna asked me to hold the baby, but she respected my boundaries. Only for a little while, I asked, and she smiled, nodding. My parents, too, seemed to realize that their influence over me had limits, and they began treating me more like the independent adult I had always been. As I sat on my couch reflecting on the past few weeks, I realized just how much power I had reclaimed. I wasn't just refusing to be manipulated, I was thriving because of it. The emotional exhaustion, the resentment, the endless babysitting demands, they were all behind me. I felt lighter than I had in years, and yet there was a quiet, almost mischievous satisfaction in knowing that my sudden departure and firm stance had left them stunned. They had expected compliance, and instead, I had given them something they couldn't control. I smiled to myself, thinking, sometimes the best revenge isn't cruelty, it's living unapologetically, fully, and on your own terms. Months passed, and life in my own space became not just normal, but extraordinary. I woke up without a knot of dread in my chest. I cooked without rushing. I lounged without guilt. The apartment felt alive, infused with my choices, my rhythm, my freedom. Every decision I made was mine, and that sense of control was intoxicating. I could hear the distant hum of the city outside my window, but it no longer felt overwhelming. It felt like a chorus celebrating the life I had reclaimed. Occasionally, I thought of my family, of the quiet tension that once shadowed every interaction. When I visited Anna now, it was different. She smiled genuinely. We laughed over silly baby antics, and the baby clutched my finger like I was his favorite person, but only when I chose to be there. There was respect now, not expectation. My parents, too, had adjusted. They called less often with manipulative undertones, and when they did, the conversations were casual, polite, sometimes even warm. I realized that my decision had forced them to confront the consequences of their overreach. I still remembered the moments of frustration, the long afternoons spent chasing a tiny whirlwind, the exhaustion that had once felt endless. But instead of resentment, I felt pride. I had stood firm, reclaimed my life, and, in the process, shown my family a truth they couldn't ignore. My time, energy, and independence were non-negotiable. The real satisfaction, though, was quiet, almost mischievous. I could see it in subtle glances, the slight hesitation when they asked for help now, the new measure of respect in their eyes. I had shocked them not with anger or confrontation alone, but with the simple, undeniable force of living unapologetically. And as I poured myself a cup of coffee that evening, watching the city lights shimmer against the dark sky, I smiled to myself. I was free, I was whole, and I had learned something no guilt trip or expectation could ever take away. Standing up for yourself isn't just about saying no, it's about saying yes to your life, your choices, and your worth.